The food system matters a whole lot, and in that, like what we eat, what we don't eat, we've got to have access to it. Justin is a rancher and a farm store owner, so we dive into how do we build out these communities and access to the farmers and ranchers that are doing things right. Justin, looking forward to talking to you, brother, and learning more. I think, our ranchers and the food producers are such an important part of, obviously, society in large. But, Texas Slim speaks so very highly of you, and I've grown to really appreciate and love what he stands for and has been doing. So if you would, tell me where you're located and kind of a brief overview about all the business aspects that you're involved in.
Sure. Well, my name is Justin Trammell, and I'm from Amarillo, Texas. And I grew up here, raised around agriculture all my life. My granddad came here whenever he was 16, and he more or less ran that outdoor sorting facility for the Amarillo Livestock Auction for, I think he retired whenever he was, maybe 10 years ago, so in his late 70s. And then my dad always worked at livestock auctions and feed yards, and so I grew up around that. And then I grew up taking care of wheat pasture cattle, and then my dad eventually got his little ranch, and so then we started, we're doing that. And so I've grown up around that. I also got to grow up going to my great-grandmother's farm up in northwest Missouri every summer, and for family reunions and such. So I got to hear stories about how my great-granddad farmed up that way, and got to hear about everything, because obviously him farming in the early 1900s, that was a very diversified operation that did have row crops, but they also had, hogs and cattle, dairy cattle, and chickens and everything else that you'd expect at a normal homestead. And so getting to do that, I was always really fascinated with the idea of a family farm, and I was kind of advised against that as I was growing up, mainly because people cared about me, and as far as everybody could see, a family farm was just not viable anymore, especially not in the same essence as what my great-granddad had up there in northwest Missouri. And so I eventually went to college here in Canyon at West Texas A&M University, and I got a degree in wildlife biology because that was pretty close as far as I was concerned, because, growing up outside like I did, I got to be around wildlife, and my grandmother had both sides of my grandparents had very great appreciation for wildlife as it was, and so that was pretty normal, and I was always very interested in the wildlife agricultural intersection, because if you talk to anybody that's in traditional agriculture, especially, wildlife or nature is the number one enemy. And if you talk to anybody in the wildlife circles, then agriculture is really the number one enemy. And growing up like I did and hearing the stories that I did with my great-granddad and everything else, that didn't really seem to be the correct answer to me. So that was something that I was very interested in. And while I was at WT, I was very fortunate to get involved with a nonprofit called the Ogallala Commons. And they specifically look at revitalizing our small town communities that inhabit the area over the Ogallala Aquifer, which is where the only place that we can get water at here. In the Great Plains region. And part of that is their entrepreneurship program and internship program, but part of that is water stewardship and wildlife, and looking at a geological feature that we have called playa lakes, that are ephemeral lakes that are not only the only way to recharge our aquifer, but they're also hotbeds for wildlife and can be used, if correctly used, be very good tools for livestock management as well. And so through that, I was then able to get in touch with different organizations such as the Quivira Coalition, which was what it used to be named. I don't remember what they changed the name to now, but I got to start going to these different conferences where I met these different producers such as Gabe Brown, who were successfully doing what I would call family farming, but doing it in a way that not only worked with the environments, but also was actually feeding people especially local people. And so throughout all that and going to these different conferences with these different organizations, I started my little farm in 2014 focusing on chickens because that seemed to be something that was manageable and that seemed to be something that people were very excited about. And so there was a lot of growing pains because I had to figure out that West Texas is a very different environment than, say, West Virginia, where in the East and West Coast, where a lot of these operations exist, because in our area, a 60-degree change during the day is not uncommon.
Yeah.
50-mile-an-hour sustained winds are not uncommon. And we also go from periods where in a year we might get 2 inches of rain to periods in a year where we get over 35 inches of rain. And so the practices that I was looking at of these other producers, while they were a good starting place, were not actual practices that ended up working in our region, just given the pressures that we have from the environment. So there was a lot of, like I said, lessons to be learned. And so I started with chickens, and then I added sheep, and then I added hogs. And then I started partnering with my dad on beef. And throughout this entire time, I was selling at the little farmers market that we started here in Canyon. And then I ended up on the board of that. And then as we were doing this, my dad, being a cattle producer, he was used to the traditional cow-calf model. And in the traditional cow-calf model, what you're doing is you're raising a herd of mama cows. You generally have a couple of bulls. You raise calves, and the mama cows have the calves, and then whenever they're weaned, you take them off and you take them to the sale barn. And since my dad was a very good cattle guy that had been around the livestock auctions, knew this region, because like I said, this region is not, it's a high desert. You know, our elevation is 3,000, 4,000 feet, which you wouldn't think just looking at it, but we're actually a high desert. And so he knew how to select the right kind of cows. They were not your traditional Black Angus cows. You actually the best cows we ever have are what would be considered rejects under traditional agriculture, but those kind of reject cows could survive and thrive in our environment. And so he was a good cow-calf guy. He would have cows that would breed back every single year, that could forage extremely well, do extremely well, produce extremely good black calves, because that's what the livestock auctions always looked for. They gave a premium for the black calves. But all that to say, because he was a good cattle guy, he could net $100 a head a year off those calves. And that was because he was a good cattle guy. That's not the norm for most cow-calf guys. You're not netting $100 a year. But even at that, even if you have a herd of 250 to 300 mama cows, $30,000 a year net is not hardly anything.
Right.
And so whenever I was selling at the farmer's market and selling, actually at that point, we were just pulling cattle straight off of our pastures at about 900 pounds, which is very unlike what most grass-finished producers are looking for, because a lot of them would consider a 900-pound animal to be underweight. But what we found was that they gave a very consistent product that was extremely good. The customers liked it. And my dad looked at the numbers and saw that selling meat off the animals as opposed to the actual animals was, the profit margin was just not even comparable to that of a normal cow-calf. And so we started looking at that pretty seriously. And luckily, before COVID hit, I had already started looking at what it would take to build a little processing facility. And through looking at that, it took me about 2 years to get through all the red tape and to be able to understand all the different regulatory burdens and different governmental agencies that we had to talk to and everything that was involved in that. And so now we've got 3 little storefronts, all within about a 15 to 20 minute radius. And we sell pretty much just to our local community. I'd say that most of the meat that we produce does not leave a 30-mile radius. And it seems to us that we're just at the beginning of this because we just have more and more new customers. We've been able to add lots of different products, from locally grown vegetables, locally milled flour, locally grown pinto beans, pistachios, We also have partnered with a family out of Alaska that they've kind of done what we've done in the beef industry, except in the wildlife or the seafood industry. And so they have their own little seafood processing facility, and they only do wild caught seafood. And so I'm able to get that directly from them. And so we've incorporated lots of different local products, like I said, the seafood. So we've got a guy who raises eggs for us now. We're getting different vegetable producers lined up. So we really created some little quasi food hubs is what they're amounting to. You don't want to call them that because if you call it a food hub, there's all sorts of different regulatory things that come with that. But all that to say that we're finally starting to make some ground. And so hopefully eventually, I always like to kind of poke fun at this, but I've only done all this so that hopefully one day I can just eventually be a farmer on my own land. So that kind of gives you a general overview of it.
No, I love that, man. That's quite a journey to get to the point that you are. I love how, honestly, that wildlife biology may have better prepared you for regenerative ag than any other thing that you could have participated in, and got an education in. So, would y'all be in the Chihuahuan Desert or the outskirts of it?
Not really. We're out on what's called the Llano Estacado. So we're in the panhandle of Texas. If you look at where Amarillo is, we're actually up on a massive plateau. So that plateau covers most of the panhandle region. As you get to Lubbock, it starts to slope off almost right at the Texas-New Mexico border. You've got a pretty sharp drop off. Going east, it's much, much less noticeable. Yeah. But like I said, we set it 3,000 to 4,000 feet actually, so that changes our weather and everything quite a bit.
So geographically, what's that population like in that 30 mile radius that you were talking about? Is this how many people are there?
Well, we're right just south of Amarillo, which is the biggest city in the Panhandle, until you get down to Lubbock, which is about 2 hours south. And so the greater Amarillo area is going to have probably around 250,000 people. But that's the biggest concentration in the Panhandle.
Okay. All right. So would a lot of your customer base be in Amarillo?
Actually, a lot of our customer base is in Canyon, just because that's where we started the market. Lots of people know me from the market, but also we have a lot of people that are the second location we opened is off of what's called a little road called McCormick Road, and we're actually just south of the Amarillo city limits. And we have, even though these storefronts are not very far away from each other, they have completely different clientele because, people don't really want to go that far. People in Canyon generally don't want to go to Amarillo for stuff, and people just south of Amarillo really don't want to go into Amarillo, and a lot of them don't even want to go to Canyon. So it's been interesting to see. We didn't know if having storefronts that close would kind of take away from each other, but it's really, I think, partially because of what we are with offering all the local stuff that we do, and just it's almost niche stuff, but I'd say it's what food used to be back before everything was commercialized. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of draw for people as far as that goes, and on top of that, our prices are not very different than the supermarket. We can't compete with the lowest tier at the supermarket, but we can sure compete with a lot of it. And we also, are able to take EBT and food stamps, and we're participating in a program called the Double Up Food Bucks program. So actually anybody that uses EBT or food stamps, we can match up to $30 that they spend, and they get to use that $30 on fruits and vegetables, and then we get reimbursed from that organization. So it's like they get an extra $30 every time they use that. So that program, we just got that done last month, so it's starting to take off, but I think that'll be just another good avenue for people, especially, anybody that has that.
Yeah. So Justin, how much of the vertical integration does that play into being competitive with some of the more big box prices?
It definitely helps. Like I said, we can't compete with the lowest of low, but as far as the mid to high tier from the box stores, we're pretty much on point with that as far as most of our prices go. The seafood is a little more expensive, but on things like that there's just no comparable quality, it doesn't seem to bother people at all. And so we've I think it just comes back down to the quality. We're able to 21-day dry age our beef. We built our facility specifically around that, which means that we have significantly less volume we can do per week, but that dry aging process creates a much higher quality carcass that's higher in protein, more easily digested, and just has better flavor overall. And so we even dry age the sheep and the hogs, and so it, we built a completely different setup than your commercial facilities, because commercial facilities, you look at quantity and how fast you can get that quantity up. And we built ours with quality and then went backwards from, okay, we want this quality. What do we have to have in order to do that? Well, we have to have a facility that's small that we can dry age things at. We also want a facility that's going to have a small enough volume that the people that are cutting these animals can focus on doing these cuts and doing them correctly and keeping the quality together, and being able to only pull one half of a beef in at a time and only work on that animal. So our ground beef, for example, is single origin animal ground beef. We only have one cow in that ground beef. Whereas commercial ground beef, you have upwards of 60 animals per pound of ground beef. So it's just a very, very different product. And like I said, the dry aging makes a huge difference. Everything down the line makes a radical difference in everything that we do.
I refer to the smaller processors, like what you're talking about, as more of the artesian processors and butcher shops, meat markets that, we used to have everywhere that are the anomaly now. But I love to see how there seems to be a resurgence in that, passion and pride in the meat aspects of food. So what have you seen offering these outlets, the retail, the services of processing, impact the community? And like, has this trickled into the school systems or maybe the college, or how has what you've built out impacted the community?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it's got some different facets to it. Because to start with, we actually had a fair amount of pushback from what would have been the official sources of help, because there's lots and lots of people and entities that told us, well, that's just not possible. That's not going to work. That's not, and they didn't really have solid reasons for why this would not work. It was just a generally accepted thing of, well, that is not possible anymore. And so we got a lot of pushback, especially to start with. Now, people are starting to come around, but we're over 2 years old now with the processing facility. Our first storefront will be 2 years old in April. So we're finally been around long enough that people are starting to go, all right, well, maybe these people aren't just some insane people off their rockers. But as far as the general community goes, first and foremost, we have to employ more people at our facility than you would if you had a comparable commercial facility that was mechanized and did not focus on this quality. So not only do we employ more people, so we employ, 15 people right now, we also make it a point to pay very good wages.
Yeah.
Because, number one, like, I've worked plenty of jobs where I didn't hardly get paid anything, and I know the quality work that attracts. So we need to employ people that are going to be serious about the quality, and we want them to stay around, and we want them to have a real living and be very fairly compensated for their ability to do things. And so we've made it a point to pay pretty high wages for our area. And like I said, it has helped with quality, but also our guys, they generally come in at around 7 in the morning. And a lot of times they're done as soon as they're done for the day. So they've got a workload that they have to do during the day. And once they're done with that, they're done with that. So sometimes they're done at noon. Sometimes they're done at 3. But it doesn't ever go much past 4. And so these people, we would try to make sure that they're fairly compensated. And on top of that, if you're getting off by 4 o'clock every day, Monday through Friday, and generally don't have to work Saturdays unless you want to, don't work Sundays, you have a lot of time to spend with your family or anything else that you're doing. So we've really tried to focus on the quality of life for our employees. And so that in and of itself, I'd say that we're able to make a big difference in just those 15 families that we employ. On top of that, as I mentioned, we have our storefronts, and we have a number of people that have really talked about how excited they are that we have these different products. We do have some people, like because of the red meat heritage hog that I raise, we have some people that buy my pork that cannot eat commercial pork. But I also don't have to feed a lot of corn and soy. I'm not having to vaccinate. I'm not having to deworm. I'm not having to give iron shots. I'm not having to do all these things. These pigs get to live out on pasture, roll in the mud, be in the dirt, be real pigs. And so between that and the dry aging process, which also helps break down anything that could be an agitator, we actually have a fair amount of customers that say that they can eat our meat and they cannot eat meat from the commercial facilities. So I think we're able to provide that. And as I mentioned, I'm also in the process of really trying to build out our production base with these different producers. So as I mentioned, we've got an egg producer. We sell more eggs than he can hardly keep up with, which is good. It means he can expand. It means we can support a whole nother producer. We've got vegetable producers that we sell lots and lots of vegetables, and between the Double Up Food Bucks program, and then as the summer goes on and everything else, and as our numbers will start to increase, as we've seen throughout the year, we're going to be able to build out a number of support systems for different vegetable producers. So incorporating these independent operations that we're then able to provide, if not all of their market, a good chunk of their market, where then they're able to go to other farmers markets or something else and capitalize on, the direct sales on top of knowing that they have a consistent market to sell to that does not exist outside of what we're doing. Because for local producers, that's, especially if you're talking about vegetables, you're not going to be able to go to even a local grocery store chain and get any kind of reasonable contract where you can have, a reliable sales income on top of that. So I think we're going to be able to really build this thing out and make it a very expansive thing, not to mention, just the base products that we provide for the community. But that's really the idea. And honestly, if I never get my own land, I already know that I probably only want to do about 300 hogs and maybe a couple of thousand birds a year, and maybe have a few cattle just because. And then I already know with the demand that we have for those products, that's not even going to fill it. So at that point, I'm actually going to be looking to find another producer to grow more of those things. Because me personally, like I said, all I want to do is get back. I want to get my own piece of land. I want to raise some of these things and have just a very simple little existence. And if I can do that, then at that point, I just want to replicate this and say, all right, let's go find another family that wants to raise hogs and chickens and do this. And then whenever we build that capacity out, once they hit capacity, you find another family. So you just add on other producers. You don't one of the big things that I've talked about in a lot of different podcasts is we look at being able to replicate, not expand.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that aspect. I think that's the only way that we truly create these self-sufficient or the resilient food systems. It's decentralized. It's localized in nature, and I think that what you're doing is incredible. I love, so much of what you're saying and doing kind of mirrors my experience with spending time, with Will Harris at White Oak Pastures. I know he has a bigger maybe wholesale aspect of that, and then more online, but still it's focusing in on his system and then helping others. He doesn't want to grow it out indefinitely. So what has that impact on the community been as far as having access to these products? Like the jobs, that's phenomenal. I love it. The partnership and the income that you're able to help generate for these farming families is amazing. But what has the consumer's response or impact been?
I mean, we just have it's really honestly easy to be in our storefronts and sell, because we have products that you just are not going to find anywhere else. Being able to say, oh, hey, these carrots were growing down in Plainview and they taste really good because of these reasons. Or, hey, this seafood came from Alaska and I know this family and I work with them. Or, hey, this flour came from Groom and they grow the wheat themselves, and actually it was just milled, 2 weeks ago. Or, hey, somebody picks up a package of patties and they go, hey, these aren't frozen yet. And you go, oh, yeah, that's because they were done this morning. I mean, we're able to offer something that is just not something you're going to find in any of these other, box grocery store chains, period. Because the quality is just different. Like I said, you're just not going to be able to find any place that you can go, oh, yeah, that steer was killed, let's see, 3 weeks ago. It was literally cut this morning, and I literally walked out of there with a big box of those fresh patties because they were just done and we needed them. So it's just, everybody that comes in, they're just floored by what we have. They're excited about it. And like I said, it's, as far as being a salesman at our storefronts, it's super easy because all you got to do is tell people about, hey, this is really cool because of these reasons. You're not actually really, I'd argue that we don't really have to do much salesmanship. It's just, hey, this is what we got and this is why it's cool.
Yeah. No, I love that. We're kicking off our 11th season of the market. So I've got a farmer's market style grocery store in Little Rock, Arkansas, and that's my day job, so to speak. And the impact with the farming partners has been beautiful. It's like for us, and we just between podcast I did earlier, and this one was talking to our strawberry farmers, our partners with that. And so what we do with them, Justin, is we buy the whole crop. We sit down and we say, what if you'll grow this, we'll buy all of it. And then it's on us to have that retail and marketing responsibility. And so, she said, we had our first red strawberry, but now we got this freeze coming in and, next week that they're getting prepared for. So it's always something, but for them to know that they have an outlet and they don't have to go set up at a farmer's market. They don't have to commit their Saturdays to doing that one-on-one customer service. And it's been beautiful. But, with that retail responsibility comes some challenges too, right? And so like if we buy all the strawberries, it means we have to figure out what to do with all the strawberries. And so jams, jellies, baked goods, all of that comes into play. Working with restaurants, having food service, and so I know that you had just posted that you have something in the works on the food service side. So let's talk about how important it is to be able to utilize the food as a finished product for people in building out these resilient food systems.
Well, so I've actually got two separate things on that, so don't let me forget. I'll just mention so we don't forget. First one has a lot to do with your regulations with your state, and I work heavily with a organization called the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance, and we lobby heavily within the state, and we've got some exciting things going on within that. But I guess there's kind of three things. The second part is that nonprofit organization that I work with, the Ogallala Commons, part of their plan for rebuilding these small town communities has to do with food availability and local food and everything else. So they, as a nonprofit organization, have stepped in and are actually acting as sort of the liaison to help set these contracts up, like you mentioned, with growers. Go ahead and pre-sell. They actually go ahead and give out the money most of the time for what these contracted crops are, and then they find places to go with them, whether it's our storefronts or we're working with TDA to get local vegetables and actually local meats into schools. So I've got a little ISD that we're going to be supplying 100 pounds of ground beef to. It's just a small one a month here pretty soon, but they're also going to be buying local vegetables because there's finally some grants that are coming out and some governmental support to do that. So the Ogallala Commons has been just instrumental in doing that. And they actually have got it set up to where that they can take on the logistical burden of moving that kind of stuff around. Because I'm not sure how far away y'all's guys are, but we're talking about a region of the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, and southwestern Kansas. And
that's big.
Big circle, but that's really what it takes because there's just really not many producers up this way because of the harsh growing environments, whether you're talking about vegetables or your animals. So
Well,
those is a big part of that. And then, as you mentioned, we're working on getting a little food truck set up, and so we'll be able to um, incorporate a lot of that. We'll see how that goes. Really, we're going to have to find somebody that's passionate about that to take that on in a fuller capacity. Otherwise, we're just going to use it here and there, for little things.
right.
But as I mentioned, one of the big things that we work on, or that I've been working on, is through the Farm Ranch Freedom Alliance, and it's our local food laws. Because, as you were mentioning about the strawberries, at least in Texas, we have a cottage food law that covers some of the base things, like people can do baked goods, they can do most jams and jellies, a few other things. But one of our big hangups right now is you have to sell it face to face, any products that fall under that. So with our storefronts, we are not legally allowed to say, if you had strawberry jam, I cannot buy that from you and then turn around and legally retail it. And
Right.
so part of what we're getting set up to work on in 2025, because our legislation meets every other year, is an expansion of the cottage food law that will allow for sales one step removed. And it seems
Good.
like we've got some pretty good support for that, and I think that we're going to be able to do that. But that's dealing with all the food regulations is really a big part of what we do, a big part of what I do, just because I've fallen into that between the processing facility and the storefronts and the local health department and TCQ and DSHS and all these other different entities that I deal with. But I think it's really equipping us to make a big difference. And then if we can get that law altered in that way, it will then open up this huge expansion for other local producers, as you mentioned.
Yeah, the Arkansas passed the Food Freedom Act. I think we're right at 2 years now, and it went from the cottage food law to the food freedom, and it was a game changer. It did open up the wholesale retail of formerly cottage food laws, and so take a look at Arkansas's Food Freedom Act, because it's not perfect, but it's much better.
If you don't mind, I'll try to get that from you afterward, because that would be helpful in designing what we're going to sit down and work on. So
Yeah, no, they did a pretty good job. I mean, it's still not there. I think most of this stuff should be opened up substantially, because the world that you and I are in, that kind of that in between, that hub aspect is pretty a small amount of people. It's a small amount of the population that do what we do, and therefore we kind of get neglected in that whole aspect of it, because it's dominated by the Walmarts, by the Krogers of the world in that retail avenue, and so these quote unquote mom and pop realm, it gets neglected. And there's a whole lot that goes into this logistics and distribution. And so, for example, my beef, partnership it's about an hour from here. The processor is in the next town over. And so round trip from the retail where we are is 80 miles. And so that still has some challenges, and that's a relatively short area. But where the market is in central Arkansas, and we've got a population base altogether around 600,000. So, like, based off of that, we have to be down here, right? We have to have the retail where the people are. But I think it's where the partnerships are so valuable in this resilient, localized food system, when you can bring it all together. And yeah, the legislations are, I mean, they are what they are until we can get them changed. But I think there's still so much we can do, so much hope. And so, Justin, I want your take on the whole. You've got the extremes, right? Like you're in a high desert, versus where I am in more of just kind of your southern temperate climate. What does regenerative agriculture look like in your world, in your area?
up here, it has a lot to do with, this entire region, before it was settled in any meaningful way, had hundreds of thousands of millions of bison coming through periodically and grazing.
Yeah.
So if you really want to get down to what actual regenerative should mean in this area, number one, it's going to mean grazing.
Yeah.
In conjunction with native pastures. And number two, it really has to do with maximizing your rainfall and then being ready and planning for drought.
Yeah.
Because drought is inevitable up here. It's always
Yeah.
going to happen. It's just when it's going to happen. And even in the years that we get rain, depending on when we get rain, we can actually experience, they don't officially call it a drought, but we experience functional drought even in years where we get a lot of rain. So like last year, for example, for the month of May, I got, just at my place alone, our average should be 16 inches. I got 32 inches of rain at my place in May alone. I had 6 inches of standing water for over a month.
Wow.
It sounds like, oh man, that would be so much water to use. It'd be great. You could do all these things. However, it killed a whole bunch of my poultry crop because I just, like, even with having places for them to get out of the water, they still had to get in the water all the time, and they just couldn't hack it. They were too small.
Yeah.
On top of that, we went from that to the first week of June, it went to 100 degrees with wind, period, and it kept that all the way through the end of August. And so while we got all that rain, it does not take many days of 100-degree plus weather with 30-mile-an-hour sustained winds to make all of that moisture disappear.
Dry it up.
And so, like I said, officially, no, we weren't in a drought. Functionally, we were in a drought.
Yeah.
And so if you're up in this region and you're planning for drought and you're incorporating grazing in that native pasture, you can get these areas back to something that's very resilient. Now, as I said, with the drought, sometimes, like in a year where we only have 2 inches of rain, like we did in 11, there's really not much you can do about that. In a year like that, you're going to have to utilize whatever stockpile you have, and then you're going to have to be okay with having sacrificed paddocks and feeding your animals hay.
Yeah.
But you have to, like I said, plan for drought, and you have to be willing to change your game plan at the drop of a hat, because that's really what it's going to come down to. But if you do that, then you can start seeing some really good results. Something that we found so my dad's ranch is over in San Juan, New Mexico. That's just right across the border of Texas and New Mexico. Functionally, it's the same. It's actually still up on Llano Estacado and everything. But some of the pastures he leases around there, that whole area is sandy soil, terrible for agriculture. And most of that area has just been utilized for cattle. However, it's just been under the traditional management of continuous grazing for generations at this point. One thing that we've done is we went in and we noticed, so one of the pastures he had, it used to be in the CRP program, and they used what they called love grass. And so it's this type of grass that does super good in sandy soils, and it was meant to stop blowing and everything else, which it did accomplish. However, it's one of those grasses that gets tall, and whenever it gets tall and rank, cattle don't eat it. It gets thick. It chokes out all the native flora and fauna. Nothing will utilize it. It's just this terrible, basically it's a huge fire hazard waiting to happen.
Yeah.
What we found is if you manage your herds right, you can actually utilize the crap out of it. Because what we found is if you mob graze that, you hit it, I think the recommended stocking rate over there is like a pair per 50 acres or 60 acres, something like that. And we did a pair per 2 acres. And we mob grazed the thunder out of it. But what we found is if you keep that love grass about 2 to 3 inches, it's actually highly palatable. And the cattle can utilize it. But it took just hammering the snot out of it, and then you have to hammer the snot out of it from about June through August. Because even with no rain, that grass has such deep roots and everything else, it will grow like crazy. And so you have to hammer it. And then come about August, you can pull your animals, separate them into smaller herds, go to your native pasture that's had all summer to grow and come along. And then you're able to utilize that native pasture from, the end of August through the rest of the year. And as long as you're utilizing it right, you have a lot of grass, and you have to be willing to pull animals. Like 3 years ago, whenever we had another drought where we didn't have hardly any rain, my dad pulled every single animal off that place. But he's also the only person now that has any grass. And it's been 2 years.
Yeah. That management's so key, isn't it? I think that's what I don't know if you listen to the Herd Quitter podcast with Jared Lumen. He had Alan Savory on, and it literally is one of my favorite podcasts of all time. And he goes into management, and it's kind of what you were saying in Alan's words is just what is our end goal and how do we apply that? And I think, he articulated it beautifully with his years. So why is that continuous grazing so detrimental to desert ranges?
Well, as I mentioned, before anything was colonized up this way, the bison would come through, and the way that bison graze is radically different than the way that cattle graze. For one, bison graze in grazing yards is what it's called. So they'll come through as a group, and they graze down an area, and then they just keep moving. And so you'd have biannual herd migrations generally. And so twice a year, you'd have giant herds of bison come through, just absolutely knock the grassland as they came through, but then they'd be gone for 6 or 8 months. And then they'd come back and do the same thing. And the thing is if it was a drought year, they're going to spend even less time in those little locales. And so depending on if it was a wet year or a dry year, they would move faster or slower. And so that's how this region evolved. On top of that, this region also evolved with fire. Right now we're currently experiencing a really terrible fire up this way.
Yeah.
But the thing is that's just part of the ecosystem. As bad as it is, it's just like parts of California and this area of Nevada. There are species, if you look at the plants, if you want to know if a place is adapted to fire, look at the plants. And if there's plants that specifically require fire or smoke to germinate and come along, you have an ecosystem that's designed to burn. And if it's not burning, then you need to use grazing to manage it in a similar way. Burning is always better, but grazing is a big, big part of that. And so that's really how this region developed. And so if you're not going to replicate that, then you're not going to come even close to getting any kind of results that you're going to want long term. And I mean, there's no changing that. There's no getting around that. You can't be crafty. There's not any way to get around that. And you have to be okay with it.
Great points, my friend. So who do you recommend as a resource, or who's been a impact on you and the way you think and your philosophies?
I mean, a lot of the mainstays, like you said, Joe Salatin, White Oak Pastures has been interesting. I really like Gabe Brown. Gabe Brown is closer to my region, and he has more of the similar types of pressures that we do. Not quite the same, but he's a lot closer. If you look at rainfall and everything else, and what he's been able to do is just phenomenal. And I don't see any reason why it can't be replicated here. There's actually a guy in Hereford, not too far from me, about 40 minutes or so. He's going back to this because he's focusing on the grasslands, but he's also focusing on the playa restoration. Like I said, those are a geological formation that's the only way to refill the aquifer. And so between the correct pasture management and focusing on restoring playas, if you look at our aquifer maps that they put out every year, his is the only little place that's getting recharge in the southern Ogallala aquifer. And he's done it enough that now there's actual measurable recharge, which is just mind-blowing because there's no other place that we're getting that. Every other place you're dealing with big pivot irrigation systems that are pumping out the water. Townships are, townships are running out of water. There's all sorts of things that are going on. But it comes back to him managing his pasture right, managing those playas right. He does a lot of sheep. He does a lot of cattle. He does organic wheat that's pasture. What is it called? Pasture cropped. So instead of plowing up the native pasture, he goes in because wheat is a winter crop. Yeah. He can go in and he can plant into native pasture that's dormant, raise a winter crop in a time that it's not going to affect any kind of native pasture, He's not plowing it up. He goes in, harvests that all, and then he leaves the residue behind, and all he's doing is providing even more ground cover for this native pasture that, he's then able to graze and do all sorts of stuff with. So there's ways to do this, but you got to really think outside the box, and you got to be willing to look at things holistically, because I would argue that if you looked at any of our systems based solely on production, from a production mindset, it's probably not going to be what you want. If you look at it based on what's being produced, the quality that's being produced, and what you're actually doing, both for the environment and the aquifer and everything else long term, whenever you bring in all the different things that are going on, that's a completely different way to look at it. And that goes into the types of animals that we raise, how big they are. Like I mentioned, like the grass finish, we raise for about a 900-pound animal. And that's not the traditional grass finished. If you look at most other places, they're looking for an 1,100 to 1,200-pound animal.
Right.
But that's not what we found that is optimal for this, if you're actually looking at production and how long it takes to get an animal to there and everything else. So it's a completely different way of looking at things.
I love it. Yeah, I had just visited with Kit Farrow, and he went into the size of the cattle being just contrary to what the norm or what the push has been, or bigger is better, and so this having something more adapted to your property makes so much more sense. And then he even went into calving in season with nature, more like what the native ruminant did, whether that was deer or an antelope or elk, whatever. And so it's just really interesting to me, the results when you're working with nature versus trying to dominate it. Seems to be a lot better, Justin, as the ones that I have followed along that are implementing those systems. So, brother, if somebody wants to learn more about your operations, what are those handles? What are the pages and business names that you've got?
On Facebook, you can find us Panhandle Meat Processing or Rancher Storefront. My individual farm is Tierloon Farm, and that's on Facebook and Instagram. And then we do have our websites, rancherstorefront.com, panhandlemeatprocessing.com, and tierloon.com. So I'm always happy to talk to anybody. I probably don't have all the answers, but I'm starting to get a decent handle on a few things anyway. So.
I love it, my friend. Thank you for what you're doing. This is such an important role for society and building communities, and I just feel like as you build out your model, and it's going to be able to inspire and help so many other people to do it across the country and world, and have it with a little bit of their own personalities and their own regionally specific ways of doing stuff, but it's still those principles are the principles for the most part. And so, thank you, brother.
I really think if we're going to talk about restoring our local food systems, the little processing facility is really where to start. Because if you can have a little processing facility available to these producers, then it's just super easy to build out a storefront and do these other things. So,
I love that, my friend. I love that. Well, have a great day, and we will be visiting again soon. Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.